This is my brother's '89 TW200. You might recognize it from my cheap bike videos, where the guys and I rode down the Trans-Wisconsin Adventure Trail. Maybe my editor can try and figure out how to put a link to those videos. Right up here somewhere. Now after 3 seasons, the thing's pretty well dialed. But wouldn't you know it, like probably most TW owners, he's looking for some more power. Let's see what we can do about that. Now an engine is basically just an air pump, so if we can get more air and fuel in and more out, we ought to be able to make more power. To do so, I turned to Bradley Performance, who specialize in modifying the TW, and while they have enough stuff to go hog wild, I ended up settling on one of their high-performance engine kits. It comes with a big bore 70mm cylinder with the option of a forged high-compression Wiseco piston. Unfortunately, that was out of stock, so I had to settle with the 9.5 cast piston. I opted out of the larger FCR carburetor and went with the mid-range cam. They also have a high-performance head that I also opted out of. The kit also comes with a nice slip-on exhaust, a modification for the Airbox, and an advanced timing cam sprocket to go with that new cam. But before we get to all those goodies, we better get some baseline figures in here so we've got something to compare to. Now I figured I'd accelerate to 60 miles an hour, but starting at 5 miles an hour to eliminate variables in starting technique. Down to 5 miles an hour. 3, 2, 1, go! Now I apologize for the reflections in the speedometer, but this was not the first time I filmed this, and I really didn't want to have to do it all over again. Also, for the record, the gearing on the bike was a 15-tooth front sprocket and a 44-tooth rear sprocket. And as you can see, the thing is not exactly a rocket ship. Now, it might not quite look like it from the view of the camera, but from my view, I stopped right at 60 miles an hour. So now with our baseline complete, let's dig in. First, let's start with removing the original exhaust. Well, there's the muffler. Looks like it's built pretty well. There is a tunable core, so you can remove this quiet core and obviously make more power, but it's going to be louder. Now, my brother is an outdoorsman, so I'm guessing he's going to want this to be pretty quiet. Now, before we bolt the new exhaust system on, let's compare the weight of the original compared to the new one. Now, the scale will not register just an exhaust system, so we're going to do the difference of my body weight. 166 even. Now, with the stock exhaust, 173.4. The stock exhaust apparently weighs 7.4 pounds. You can see I've got the clamp, hardware. I didn't want to jam the mid pipe fully into the muffler and then have to wiggle the thing out. So I just taped the springs in place for the time being. 170 even. So the Bradley exhaust is 3.4 pounds lighter. Nice. According to the picture on Bradley Performance's website, it looks like the muffler slides on to about this line that I marked on there. It seems like it'd be easier putting the muffler and mid-pipe together without it being on the bike, but you have to get it clocked just right, and I think it's going to be really tight on here. It goes on the header pipe just fine. Good grief, that thing is tight. Bolt. Spacer. Just thread in there a little for me. Okay, there. So now the mid pipe is clamped tightly onto the header pipe. We just want to make sure that it's clocked in the right position. And see, the muffler isn't round either, so it Nice to have it straight up and down. Now that we know everything is clocked pretty good, I'm gonna try to carefully knock this thing forward. I'm gonna put some duct tape on here just to kind of protect it a little bit. Even though I'm going to be using a rubber mallet that hopefully will not ding up that muffler. I think we'll take this clamp off here. Is it moving? It's going on a little. Let's make sure I'm not damaging anything. Oh yeah, it looks mint. All right. Now, if you've never worked with exhaust springs like this before, having a simple tool like this really makes life easier. I believe this one is from Motion Pro, but there's plenty of other ones out there, I'm sure. I've got to help it go up. Oh yeah. See how easy that went? It's not that easy if you're trying to do that with a pliers. Spacer. Of course. All right, now thread, you little bugger. Stay. Oh, I know it. You little devil. This time let's get the wrench on there first. Go in there, come on. All right, it's definitely started. Now we can make sure it's on there straight. As you can see, I've done all this without even taking any of the plastic off, which is kind of handy. The stock exhaust also bolts on right here at this passenger peg. Now, as you can see, Kyle has this tusk rack on here that caused my leg to bleed. So he's already got this special bolt on there. So we're just going to use this nut and I can stash away that bolt and put this nut on right back here. Next, we'll take care of the Airbox modification, which should help the engine breathe a little easier. Right there is the air filter. The air going to the engine comes from underneath the seat right in here. So it has to come in through this tube, come this direction, make a 90-degree turn this direction, and then a 90-degree turn through the filter, and then in the airbox it makes another 90-degree turn to go into the carburetor. The idea is to cut a hole so that the air can just go straight in here and eliminate some of this snorkel. So here's what you get from Bradley Performance. You get this bracket, some more foam. Not only are we cutting a hole, we're actually adding filter to that hole, and some screws to hold it all together. This is where we want to make our hole. This will be our template. So I'm just going to use this silver Sharpie marker. We're just going to trace this out. So here's what I'm going to use to cut the hole. I'm going to start with a drill with a 1/4-inch bit and a jigsaw with a shallow blade, front to rear, so that I can make corners sharper. Since these turns are so sharp at the corners, we might as well drill 4 holes so that we have a nice radius turn, and then we'll just connect the dots with the saw. But before we get to that, there is a support for the air filter itself. We don't want to cut that up. Another thing to note is this peg right here. We want to make sure that we're not going to cut that off, because that is a support for the air filter support. And as we look over here, our hole should be just above that. This is an 1/8-inch bit. There, so now we have our holes all established. And we just have to put the foam in there. So I've now got my air filter all oiled up with some foam filter oil. That oil helps trap dirt particles in the foam so that it doesn't just work its way right on through. So there is our freer flowing airbox cover. I did find it interesting that if you run the side cover in place without modifying it, it pretty much makes this modification completely useless, because this would go right up against that and just cover it right up again. You can either run without this, but it doesn't look that great. However, I think if it were my bike, I would drill a bunch of holes and just try to do it really nice and neat so that I could breathe right through both this cover and that one. So here's how I'm going to modify this side panel. I've got this 3/4 inch hole saw already, so 3/4 inch it is. And it seems like an appropriate size. I've kind of played around with mocking up where to put the holes with these 1/4 inch washers, and then I just marked it with a Stabilo pencil. Let's drill some more holes. Now after drilling the holes, you get these burrs on here and little curly cues and stuff. So it's a perfect time to use a deburring tool. And there we go. Almost looks factory. And on this bike, that red foam matches the frame about perfectly. Ha ha ha, not too bad. With these mods made, the engine will now be able to breathe its air a little easier. So now we need to make up for that by giving it a little more fuel. If you neglect this step, the engine will run lean, and if it's like my first four-wheeler, it'll burn the exhaust valve and you'll lose compression. Now, while I can't give you the perfect carburetor setup because each situation is different, I can give you a handful of tips that'll make your life a whole lot easier, such as warming up the airbox boot with a heat gun or even a hair dryer, because these things have a tendency of becoming incredibly stiff. I went with a jet kit from ProCycle, and it came with instructions that ought to get your jetting pretty close. Now here's a tip that I wish I would have done years ago for working on these little Japanese carburetors, and that's getting the proper screwdrivers. The screws may look like a Phillips, but they're actually a JIS, which stands for Japanese Industrial Standard. At this point I didn't have them yet, but eventually I picked up this cheap set off of Amazon, and it's amazing how much better they grab the screws, and I was previously using Snap-on. Now the main jets and pilot jets are made out of brass, so they're real soft and they're easy to strip. So here's another plug for the cheap screwdriver that you're not afraid to modify. So here's my El Cheapo screwdriver that I filed. And you can see the edges are kind of rounded off to fit down inside of some carburetors. But right now I just took and hand filed down the tip just a little bit to make it thin enough to fit right down into this main jet. Yeah, it fits down in there real nice. Gets a good grab on that main jet so it doesn't strip it out. Now the pilot jets are even more delicate, and if they've been in there a while and your screwdriver doesn't grab them really well, they'll strip out before you can say, ah, crap. And so I've got this other cheapy screwdriver. I believe I filed a little bit on the end of this one too and trued up the tip. So this should fit down in there real nice. If you need to put it down on something so you can really push on it really well. Yeah. When they say to put the shims underneath the needle is here on the slide, and if you look up underneath here, you can push the needle up. You put shims underneath this circlip. Other carburetors will have multiple grooves that this circlip will go into, but the original only has one. So in order to raise this needle up to give it more fuel quicker, you need to put shims underneath this circlip. Now, one of the things that really tripped me up is this carburetor had an aftermarket needle that was considerably different than the original. So do yourself a favor, hang on to that original needle. And now here are those little shims that you can play around with, putting underneath the circlip on your needle. Now, before we try jamming the carburetor on there, I like taking a little bit of dielectric grease or silicone grease, just because I know that it won't do funny things with rubber products like petroleum stuff apparently can sometimes. This will help that carburetor pop into place a lot easier. That can sometimes be difficult. And let's warm up the airbox boot. A little bit of grease in there too. Pop this thing in there.
Oh, like nothing. That can fight you sometimes, depending on your bike.
Now, of course, hooking up your throttle cables, you got to make sure you have the right one pulling and the right one pushing.
So when I run the throttle, that one pulls. That's the right one there. Oh, you little. There we go. Now would be a good time to make sure you don't have too much free play in your throttle. So it can be really annoying if you have a lot of free play in your throttle and you have that little delay. This has got just a little bit.
Now, I wish I could tell you what carburetor settings to use and you'd be done, but it's probably going to take you a few times to get it right. So here's a few tips that'll hopefully save you a little bit of time and hassle. In a previous rebuild, the float bowl screws on this carburetor had been replaced with Allen head bolts, and that ended up being pretty handy.
I've got my Allen wrench set here, and these are a 3mm. While I can get at these somewhat decent, this thing is pretty long. Now I could lop this off, but I don't really want to do that to this set. If you're like me, and when you buy your motorcycle parts or whatever parts, sometimes they'll come with an Allen key. And so I've got this little tray that I put all my extra Allen keys in. I will oftentimes have that size already in my sets, but I will hang on to those because in this situation, this one is much shorter. So obviously you can get in there and tighten up your Allen screws a lot better on the exhaust side. Fortunately on the TW, I can reach my hand underneath here and get at it like this. But if I did need to hack this off, I wouldn't care because I probably got 3 other ones in my little tray. So here's another little tip getting back to the screwdriver. I've got my cheap screwdriver that I hand filed to make fit that main jet real good. Well, I just got done taking the bike for a little test spin and it was acting lean again as far as I could tell. So I'm gonna try going up one more main jet, but I didn't wanna have to take the whole bike apart. So you can see I've got the float ball off of there and figured I was just gonna go and change the main jet like this without having to take the whole doggone bike apart. But I couldn't quite fit the screwdriver in there because it was hitting the engine case. So this is just a cheap screwdriver, hacked off the handle. There, so now I've got that in the main jet. You can see it clears just fine. So don't be afraid to have some cheaper screwdrivers like this that you're not afraid to cut and change. For the idle mixture screw, which on this carburetor is right there, they make special screwdrivers for that. And this one, you can see the handle has been belt sanded off to clear my DRZ. That special little screwdriver was not expensive, just is enough to get up into the idle mixture screw. So you can dial that in with everything on the bike while it's running. So sometimes these little cheap tools are all you need. So here's another little tip. I need to put another shim underneath the needle. And instead of taking the carb completely out of there, we can loosen up the clamps here on the boots and just pivot the carburetor over. And then we can get at the top here, pull the cap off and put another shim in there. Okay, time for test number 2 with the Bradley Performance exhaust on there and the Airbox modification. And the jetting now ended up being 110 on the main jet from the Pro Cycle kit and 4 shims underneath the needle. Oh gosh. So let's go and see how much quicker it is. It does sound a little bit more healthy with that exhaust. It's not obnoxious, but it is louder than the stock exhaust. It is definitely a little bit louder, and it also definitely cruises a little easier at higher speeds. All right, we're going up to 5 miles an hour in 3, 2, 1. I think that seems a little bit quicker.
And it was. As you can see, by the time the modded bike made it to 60 miles an hour, the stock bike was at about 55. So while I can't tell you exactly how much power we gained here, I can tell you that it's noticeable. Plus we got rid of some weight, the exhaust looks way better, and honestly I think it sounds a lot better too. And while modifying to this extent is probably fine for most people, we're not done yet. Time for the big bore kit and a cam. Let's go! So if you'd like to see that, along with the struggles, better tear it apart again. Then go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you can see the next video as soon as it comes out. Thanks for watching.